Will Ding Liren be the man to topple Magnus Carlsen? Well, first he has to win the candidates, and first he has to actually qualify for the candidates. So he hasn't actually qualified yet, but he looks highly likely to, because Sergei Karyakin has been disqualified, an appeal is pending but doesn't look likely to pay off, and so then the next spot would go to whoever's got the highest rating on the May 2022 ratings list. Now that looks set to be Ding. He'd then be playing in the candidates, and I'm really pleased because he is the world number 2, an astonishingly good player. He's going to bring so much to the tournament, and he's kind of my favourite going into it, to be honest. I want Alireza to win. I'd love to see that matchup with Magnus, but I'd say that Ding has to be the favourite, world number 2, so experienced, 29 years old, from China, such an exceptional player. So I'm looking back today at a game he played against Jan Nepomniachtchi in the last candidate cycle. So this actually took place last year, and this game's just phenomenal. Played with the white pieces. Let's check it out. So he kicked off with pawn to d4 here. Knight f6 from Jan, pawn to c4, pawn g6, and now f3 from Ding, the so-called anti-Grunfeld variation. And it's so called because if black goes d5 now, going in for a Grunfeld, we can capture, knight recaptures, but this knight hasn't yet developed to c3, so now you can go e4, there's no captures on c3, the knight gives ground. Now this is playable for black, but it's a different position, decent space advantage for white, different game. So Jan didn't want to go in for that. Instead of going d5, he played pawn e6 here. And after e4 from Ding, he then followed up with c5. So he's heading for a Benoni structure. Ding kicked on with pawn to d5. d6 from Jan, standard developing move. And now this next move needs explanation because the bishop gets brought to d3. And I believe I'm correct in saying this was actually a novelty at the time. And this knight then wants to come to e2 and c3. But the whole idea of developing these kingside pieces like this, delaying the b1 knight from coming out, is that this one actually wants to go to d2 and then c4 in the future. And Ding's foreseeing that the pawns will capture here, the c pawn recaptures, that opens up the c4 square for this knight. So that's what his play is centered around now. So bishop g7 from Jan, this knight came to e2, we had the captures on d5 as predicted, the pawn recaptured, opening the c4 square. Now the knight came to d7, and this one came to c3. So this one's now got the journey that it wants to go on later in the game. Pawn a6 from Jan, he wants b5, so Ding clamps on that. And now you could castle here, but Jan plays really actively. So white has the centre, white has the space, long-term advantages. This knight's coming to c4, the bishop to f4, pressure here. So Jan goes knight to h5, he wants to drum up a counterattack against the white king, go for an initiative there. So castles from Ding, now the bishop came to d4 with check, king h1, the knight came to e5, and now Ding correctly sees that he has to challenge one of these attacking pieces. It's also quite difficult to develop the queen side at the moment, so he drops this knight back to e2 and hits this attacking bishop on d4. But Jan ignores that threat. Not that the bishop has anywhere to go. He goes queen to h4 here, pressuring the king, and now if white takes on d4, which Ding did, black can actually pick up an exchange by going knight g3. Now Jan didn't play this immediately, but we do see it in the game. He didn't play it straight away because after king to g1, knight takes on f1. Yes, after bishop captures, pawn takes here, queen takes, black's picked up an exchange. But in compensation for that, white has the bishops, also an extra pawn. Pawn f4 is coming, opening up the dark squares. You've got b3, bishop to b2, really dangerous for black here, and white is actually better when you run this with the engine. So both players correctly assessed this. Jan didn't go in for it. His best move here was actually simply takes on d4. Okay, game goes on, double-edged. Then black keeps attacking. But what Jan did here was take on d3. Now strategically this isn't good, because the queen recaptures, you've gotten rid of the bad bishop for white, you've given up that wonderful knight, But the reason Jan did this was for tactical reasons. He gets knight g3 check, king g1, knight takes, he's picked up that exchange. And what he would have been foreseeing is that after queen recaptures, the king then still holds this pawn. He then takes the knight here. He's an exchange up, should be doing okay, but it's still a kind of dynamic balance. But what Ding did was not capture that knight on f1. He played an excellent move after knight takes, knight c2 here, retreating that knight from the attack and actually making this one look really foolish, because after it takes on h2, which was its only move, where is that knight actually going? It's completely trapped. And queen e3 really hits home that fact, because now Ding's threatening to go queen f4 or queen g5, trade the queens, then pick up the knight. Now the best for black here was actually pawn g5. This is a really cool line actually, because if the queen captures, you can actually chop those ones off, the bishop takes back, and you take on f3 with check. And the whole idea is that you're ripping open the g-file, black's actually winning this one, you're picking up the bishop, really good position. So we didn't have that g5 move played, unfortunately, although even if Jan had gone g5, white doesn't have to take that. You could carry on with e5 or developing this knight, still better for white. But okay, not easy to spot g5 of course. Jan simply castled. Now we had queen g5, and now it's impossible to avoid the exchange of queens or save the knight. So Jan goes for the kamikaze, he takes on f3, the pawn recaptures, and now he does get to keep the queens on the board, but of course he's given that knight. This is better for white. And now really classy from Ding, he doesn't passively defend this pawn, he goes bishop f4 developing, gives the pawn, but then develops the knight with tempo. All his pieces are flooding out, this one is weak, and there's problems around his king on the dark squares. And that's why Jan can't go queen to d3 here, because then there's queen f6. You can actually leave that piece on prise, you're bringing in your bishop, big problems on g7. So Jan saw this of course, he didn't go queen d3, but where's that queen actually going? If you come to g4 with check, we simply trade, then pick up your pawn. So pawn f6 was tried, hitting the white queen, counter-attacking this attack, but now Ding can simply pick up a pawn. So he takes on g6 with check, the pawn recaptures, then he takes here, and this endgame is hopeless, because not only is d6 dropping, but then c5 will fall, and this pawn's going through really quickly. So Jan tried bishop to g4, but the knight hopped back, it's finally heading for c4, so bishop e2 covered that one, but now king f2 with tempo, bishop d3, and knight e1, another excellent move. This must be the theme of the game, trapping minor pieces, because this bishop actually has nowhere to go now. So pawn c4 was played to protect it, but now Ding simply picked up on d6. Now the rook comes to the e-file here. If it comes to d8, then you're actually just running into another tempo for white with bishop c7 and d6. So that's why rook e8 was played, but now simply takes on d3, the pawn recaptured, and bishop c7. And look how fast this pawn's running through now down the board. King f7 was played, rook a3, corralling this pawn. This rook came to c8, pawn d6, king e6 covers this d7 square, stops the pawn coming. Now rook takes on d3, king d7, and knight c4. Finally the knight hits that wonderful square. The rook has to capture here because this one's coming in with check, and even despite the capture, the knight checked anyway, and here Jan actually resigned. The game is gone. Why did he resign? Well, say you go king to c6, we simply capture on c7. If you take the knight here, we're bringing down the rook. We're either winning your rook or promoting to a queen. And if instead of taking the knight, you take the pawn, well, now there's knight d5 check. King moves, you pick up on f6. You also hold e4. White's simply a whole piece up here, not even for a pawn, it's game over. If you enjoyed this Ding game, then click here to see my whole candidates preview. Thanks for watching, see you soon.